Daf Yomi Tractate Bava Batra, page 44b. Actually, we're still on 44a because of time yesterday had to end a little bit early. So we're in the last few lines of 44a, and when we get to 44b, it will be announced. The bottom of 44a, the Gemara offers a new explanation of the Brisa. Rather, explain instead, in accordance with the statement of Ravin Bar Shmuel, as Ravin Bar Shmuel says in the name of Shmuel, one who sells a field to another, even without a guarantee that if the field will be repossessed, the seller will compensate the buyer for his loss, cannot testify with regard to ownership of that field on behalf of the buyer, because he is establishing the field before his creditor. The Gemara clarifies this by noting, and this is the case specifically in the case of a house or a field. But in the case of a cow or a cloak, he is not biased in his testimony and can testify on behalf of the buyer. The Gemara explains, it is not necessary to say that this is the halacha, and now we're starting 44b on the top of the words bistama delo mishtadale. In a case where he sold a cow or cloak without specification, where it is not liened to the creditor. What is the reason for this? It is because these items are movable property, and movable property is not liened to a creditor. And even though it is so that the debtor wrote to the creditor that he can collect the debt even from the cloak that is on his shoulders, that matter applies only when it is as is and in the possession of the debtor, but not if it is not as is. Since it is in the possession of the buyer, then no, the creditor cannot collect from movable property. Therefore, the debtor can testify on behalf of the buyer. The Gemara continues, but even in a case where he set the cow or cloak aside as designated repayment, the creditor cannot collect from it. What is the reasoning? It is in accordance with the statement of Rava. As Rava says, if a master set aside his slave as designated repayment of a debt and then sold him, the master's creditor collects the debt from the proceeds from the sale of the slave. But if one set aside his ox or his donkey as designated repayment and then sold it, the creditor does not collect the debt from the proceeds of the sale of the ox or the donkey. What is the reason for this distinction? This setting aside of the slave is designated repayment, as designated repayment generates publicity, and that setting aside of the ox or donkey as designated repayment does not generate publicity. Therefore, when the slave had been set aside as designated repayment, the buyer would have been aware of this, since he bought the slave while having this knowledge. The slave can be seized from him by the seller's creditor. By contrast, the buyer of the cow or cloak would not have been aware that it had been set aside as designated repayment. So the seller's creditor cannot seize it from him. The Gemara asks, but let there be a concern that perhaps the debtor transferred the movable property to the creditor, not for him to own, but for him to have a lien on the movable property by means of, in other words, together with acquisition of land. As Rabbah said, if the debtor transferred movable property to the creditor as lien property by means of an acquisition of land, the creditor acquires the land and acquires the movable property. In other words, a lien is created with regard to both. And Rav Chisda said, and that is the halacha, only where the debtor wrote to the creditor, this lien is not like a transaction with inconclusive consent, which does not affect acquisition, and not like the template for documents, which are not actually used to collect debts. Rather, it is a legally binding document. The Gemara answers with, what are we dealing here? We are dealing with a case where the debtor had purchased the movable property and immediately sold it, and there was no opportunity for him to have it become lien to a creditor. Therefore, there is no possibility of his having been biased to his testimony due to a desire to repay his debt. The Gemara asks, but let there be a concern, perhaps. It is a case in which just thinking out loud, that the word opportunity, we mentioned opportunity a moment ago. Opportunity has an English gematria value of 189. And when it comes to the 42 journeys, we just started the 9th journey. And the 9th journey of the 42 journeys is Dafka. And Dafka has a Hebrew gematria value of 189, just like opportunity. Now, what's the connection between Dafka and opportunity? Besides the fact that we said Davka, not Dofka, but Davka in today's Daf, but there's a famous English expression, when opportunity knocks. And Dafka means knock, like Dafak Wadelet, knocking on the door. And so it's a neat correlation that it happened to come out on Dafka. Dafka came out on Dafka. But there's another connection. That Dafka, which happened on our Daf, is 111, which is a place where I oftentimes eat on Shabbat. And Dafka can also have a connection to Hammer, because Mr. Hammer told me that Dafka was 111. And 111 is oftentimes what I eat on Shabbat, as God willing will be the case this Shabbat. And I think that's all the connections for now. But I will continue as soon as I mark this down. 11:49. 11:49. See, this is the kind of stuff that really keeps me interested, Gematria. But not just Gematria. Actually connecting ideas, how it's relevant. Relevantit. You know what I mean? 111, 30, and 12. 111. I mean, the alternate would be to find, 111, 30, and 12. Which becomes 3. Dafka. Davka. Dofka. Davka. Daf. Kaf Aleph. Dav. Kaf Aleph. I forgot where I was holding actually. After all that fun. But I should be able to find it easily. And why would I be able to find it easily? Because I said the word opportunity. That's how I got in this whole rabbit trail. And as soon as I find that, the second I find it, actually the nanosecond that I find it, well, I don't know about that, but the moment I find it, I will be saying it. Are you understanding Yiddish? Opportunity, there we go. Moment. And there was no opportunity for him to have it become leaned to the creditor. Therefore, there is no possibility of his being biased in his testimony due to a desire to repay the debt. The Gemara asks, but let there be a concern that perhaps it is a case where the debtor wrote to the creditor, I will repay you even from that which I will require in the future, which would presumably mean that the creditor can collect from the buyer, even though the debtor purchased the item after taking the loan. From the fact that this is not a concern, do you learn from it that even if the debtor wrote, I will repay you even from that which I will require in the future, and then he then purchased and sold property, or purchased and bequeathed it, that which he purchased is not lien to his creditor, this would seem to settle what is otherwise assumed to be an unresolved question. The Gemara rejects this proof. No. How are we doing on time here? Okay. The Gemara rejects this proof. No. One need not reach that conclusion, as it is necessary to teach the halacha case where witnesses say, we know about this one who sold these items, that he never had any land. Therefore, it cannot be that the creditor acquired a lien on the movable property by means of an acquisition of land. The Gemara asks, but doesn't Rav Papa say that even though the sages said, in the case of one who sells a field to another without a guarantee, and a creditor came and repossessed it, the buyer cannot return to the seller. In other words, the debtor who sold him the field to claim reimbursement. But if it is found that the field was not the seller's in the first place, the buyer can return to the seller to claim reimbursement. In this case, if the claimant establishes that the cow or cloak is in his hand and was not the seller's, the buyer will be able to claim reimbursement. The seller is therefore biased in his testimony and should not be able to testify on behalf of the buyer. The Gemara answers, with what are we dealing here? We are dealing with a case where the buyer admits that he recognizes that this is the offspring of the seller's donkey and will not claim it in court, that the seller had no right to sell it. The Gemara returns to the statement of Rav Papa and comments, here's a case where Rav Papa, connecting to Wednesday, can even apply on Thursday. Like today is Thursday, and I'm connecting Rav Papa to Wednesday, even though it's Thursday, because I saw Ruvain on Yom Revi'i, in other words, Tuesday night. But in contrast to the opinion of Rav Papa, Rav Zvid says, even if it is found that the field is not the seller's, the buyer cannot return to the seller to claim reimbursement, as the seller can say to the buyer, it is for this reason that I sold it to you without a guarantee. In other words, that if it is taken from you, I will not bear liability. The Gemara returns to Shmuel's statement in order to examine the matter itself. Rabban Bar Shmuel says in the name of Shmuel, one who sells a field to another, even without a guarantee, if the field will be repossessed, the seller will compensate the buyer for his loss, cannot testify with regard to ownership of that field on behalf of the buyer, because he is establishing the field before his creditor. The Gemara asks, what are the circumstances of this halacha?